The peaceful morning on a quiet rural farm is shattered by the sudden arrival of a group of armed men. They storm onto the property, unaware of the man they are about to confront. The protagonist, a black man with a calm and collected presence, stands motionless in the face of their aggression. He knows the stakes of this encounter, but they have no idea who he really is. As the tension builds, his past as a Delta Force commander looms beneath the surface, ready to emerge when need. The sun had just risen over the sprawling fields of the farm, casting a golden glow across the rows of crops. The stillness of the morning was only broken by the gentle hum of nature, the soft rustle of the wind through the trees, the chirp of birds waking up, and the distant moo of cattle. It was a place where peace and solitude reigned, far from the chaos of the world. On the porch of the farmhouse stood James Carter, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee. His face, though aged, remained sharp and vigilant, his eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting something. His mind, trained over years of military service, was never at ease. Even in moments of supposed tranquility, his instincts never fully rested. The peace was broken suddenly, the distant sound of engines roaring to life, cutting through the morning calm. It was a sound that James had heard before, but never on his own property. His hand tightened around the mug, his gaze narrowing. Beat-up truck appeared at the end of the dirt road, followed by a second one and then a third. They rumbled forward, kicking up dust as they approached his farm with an unmistakable sense of purpose. James stood tall, his posture straightening as his military training kicked in instinctively. The trucks screeched to a halt just outside the gate, and within seconds, men in heavy work boots and faded camouflage jumped out, their movements fast and coordinated. James recognized the look in their eyes. They were here for a reason, and it wasn't a friendly visit. One of the men, the leader it seemed, stepped forward. A smug grin stretched across his face. He was a large man, his bulk accentuated by his thick flannel shirt. A rifle hung loosely from his shoulder, and a knife was strapped to his belt. His eyes scanned the farm as if he were sizing up a target, but they landed on James, who was standing unmoved on the porch. "Morning, partner," the man called out with mock cheerfulness, his voice carrying the arrogance of someone who believed they had control of the situation. "Looks like you've got yourself a nice little piece of land here. Hope you don't mind a little business." James's eyes flicked over the group. He counted 6 men in total, all of them armed. They had no idea who they were dealing with, no idea who he was, and that was going to be their mistake. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He took a slow sip of his coffee, the steam rising from the cup dissipating into the morning air. "What's the business exactly?" His voice was calm, collected, the kind of voice that could make anyone second-guess their choices. The leader of the men smiled widely, stepping forward as he raised a hand to his chest. "Just a friendly little visit. We've heard there's something worth taking on this land of yours. Something valuable." James didn't flinch. He hadn't flinched when he heard the engines. He hadn't flinched when the trucks arrived, and he wouldn't flinch now. The men were making the fatal mistake of underestimating him, of thinking that he was just a farmer, just a black man in the middle of nowhere, unaware of the potential storm they were about to unleash. "You'll want to turn around," James said evenly, his eyes never leaving the leader's face, "before things get out of hand." The leader laughed, a loud, hearty sound that echoed across the quiet farm. "Out of hand? What, you gonna put up a fight, old man? You think we're just going to leave you alone?" James set the coffee mug down slowly, the action deliberate. He took a step forward, his boots crunching softly on the wooden planks of the porch. His eyes were now locked onto the leaders, and there was something in them, something cold and unyielding. The men behind their leader began to fidget, some of them shifting uneasily as they realized the weight of the moment. The leader, however, kept his bravado up, unwilling to show any sign of weakness. "We've got all day, you know," the leader said, grinning even wider. "I suggest you don't make this harder on yourself." James didn't respond. Instead, he moved with a speed that caught the leader off guard. In a flash, he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a concealed firearm. Not the kind that belonged to a farmer, but a weapon with the precision and deadly efficiency of a trained soldier. In one fluid motion, he aimed the weapon at the leader's chest. The men froze, their eyes widening in shock. The leader himself was now standing completely still, his face draining of color as he realized his mistake. James spoke, his voice cold but commanding. "You'll leave, now, or I'll make sure you never get the chance to make threats again." The leader's bravado faltered as the reality of the situation set in. The group had come here expecting an easy raid. They had expected to intimidate, to steal without consequence. What they didn't know was that James Carter was no ordinary farmer. He had been a commander in Delta Force, a highly specialized unit in the U.S. military, trained for covert operations, counter-terrorism, and the most dangerous of missions. He had seen combat in places most people couldn't even name. The farm was his sanctuary, but the skills he had learned in war were never far behind. The leader finally opened his mouth, his voice shaking slightly. "You don't know who you're messing with, man. We can take you down." James took a step. Closer, his expression unchanged. "I've dealt with men like you before. You're out of your depth." In the tense silence that followed, the men surrounding the leader began to exchange uneasy glances, their bravado slipping. The air was thick with the realization that they had made a mistake, and that mistake was about to cost them. The leader and his men now realize the danger they've walked into, but it's too late to back out. James Carter, a man they thought they could overpower, stands before them, a force to be reckoned with the skills and training of a Delta Force commander. James is more than capable of defending his land and making sure these men learn a lesson they won't soon forget. But what will James do next? Will he take the fight to them, or will he show them mercy? Full Chapter 2. The silence that followed James's last words was thick, heavy with the weight of the tension in the air. The men surrounding him seemed to freeze, their postures stiffening as they realized the gravity of the situation. What had started as an attempted robbery, a simple raid on what they had assumed was an unsuspecting farmer's land, had suddenly taken a very different turn. James Carter, still standing on his porch, his posture unwavering, wasn't just a farmer. He wasn't just a quiet black man in the middle of nowhere. He was someone who had seen the worst of humanity, someone who had been trained to confront danger head-on. And now, these men who had underestimated him were faced with the deadly reality of their mistake. The leader, who had earlier been so confident, now looked visibly shaken. His large hands fidgeted, his gaze flicking nervously between James and his crew. His bravado had all but evaporated, replaced by a sinking fear that none of his threats or insults could cover up. I don't know who you think you are," the leader stammered, trying to regain some semblance of control. "But you don't scare us. We outnumber you. You're alone out here." James didn't move a muscle. His eyes, however, never left the leader's face, calm, unfazed, a steady calm that seemed to strip away the man's bluster, leaving only the raw truth of the situation. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," James said softly, his voice colder than before. "You're not just trespassing on my property, you're trespassing on my peace." The peaceful morning on a quiet rural farm is shattered by the sudden arrival of a group of armed men. They storm onto the property, unaware of the man they are about to confront. The protagonist, a black man with a calm and collected presence, stands motionless in the face of their aggression. He knows the stakes of this encounter, but they have no idea who he really is. As the tension builds, his past as a Delta Force commander looms beneath the surface. ready to emerge when need. The sun had just risen over the sprawling fields of the farm, casting a golden glow across the rows of crops. The stillness of the morning was only broken by the gentle hum of nature, the soft rustle of the wind through the trees, the chirp of birds waking up, and the distant moo of cattle. It was a place where peace and solitude reigned, far from the chaos of the world. On the porch of the farmhouse stood James Carter, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee. His face, though aged, remained sharp and vigilant, his eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting something. His mind, trained over years of military service, was never at ease. Even in moments of supposed tranquility, his instincts never fully rested. The peace was broken suddenly, the distant sound of engines roaring to life, cutting through the morning calm. It was a sound that James had heard before, but never on his own property. His hand tightened around the mug, his gaze narrowing. Beat-up truck appeared at the end of the dirt road, followed by a second one and then a third. They rumbled forward, kicking up dust as they approached his farm with an unmistakable sense of purpose. James stood tall, his posture straightening as his military training kicked in instinctively. The trucks screeched to a halt just outside the gate, and within seconds, men in heavy work boots and faded camouflage jumped out, their movements fast and coordinated. James recognized the look in their eyes. They were here for a reason, and it wasn't a friendly visit. One of the men, the leader it seemed, stepped forward. A smug grin stretched across his face. He was a large man, his bulk accentuated by his thick flannel shirt. A rifle hung loosely from his shoulder, and a knife was strapped to his belt. His eyes scanned the farm as if he were sizing up a target, but they landed on James, who was standing unmoved on the porch. "Morning, partner," the man called out with mock cheerfulness, his voice carrying the arrogance of someone who believed they had control of the situation. "Looks like you've got yourself a nice little piece of land here. Hope you don't mind a little business." James's eyes flicked over the group. He counted 6 men in total, all of them armed. They had no idea who they were dealing with, no idea who he was, and that was going to be their mistake. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He took a slow sip of his coffee, the steam rising from the cup dissipating into the morning air. "What's the business exactly?" His voice was calm, collected, the kind of voice that could make anyone second-guess their choices. The leader of the men smiled widely, stepping forward as he raised a hand to his chest. "Just a friendly little visit. We've heard there's something worth taking on this land of yours, something valuable." James didn't flinch. He hadn't flinched when he heard the engines. He hadn't flinched when the trucks arrived, and he wouldn't flinch now. The men were making the fatal mistake of underestimating him, of thinking that he was just a farmer, just a black man in the middle of nowhere, unaware of the potential storm they were about to unleash. "You'll want to turn around," James said evenly, his eyes never leaving the leader's face, "before things get out of hand." The leader laughed, a loud, hearty sound that echoed across the quiet farm. "Out of hand? What, you gonna put up a fight, old man? You think we're just going to leave you alone?" James set the coffee mug down slowly, the action deliberate. He took a step forward, his boots crunching softly on the wooden planks of the porch. His eyes were now locked onto the leaders, and there was something in them, something cold and unyielding. The men behind their leader began to fidget, some of them shifting uneasily as they realized the weight of the moment. The leader, however, kept his bravado up, unwilling to show any sign of weakness. "We've got all day, you know," the leader said, grinning even wider. "I suggest you don't make this harder on yourself." James didn't respond. Instead, he moved with a speed that caught the leader off guard. In a flash, he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a concealed firearm. Not the kind that belonged to a farmer, but a weapon with the precision and deadly efficiency of a trained soldier. In one fluid motion, he aimed the weapon at the leader's chest. The men froze, their eyes widening in shock. The leader himself was now standing completely still, his face draining of color as he realized his mistake. James spoke, his voice cold but commanding. "You'll leave, now, or I'll make sure you never get the chance to make threats again." The leader's bravado faltered as the reality of the situation set in. The group had come here expecting an easy raid. They had expected to intimidate, to steal without consequence. What they didn't know was that James Carter was no ordinary farmer. He had been a commander in Delta Force, a highly specialized unit in the U.S. military, trained for covert operations, counter-terrorism, and the most dangerous of missions. He had seen combat in places most people couldn't even name. The farm was his sanctuary, but the skills he had learned in war were never far behind. The leader finally opened his mouth, his voice shaking slightly. "You don't know who you're messing with, man. We can take you down." James took a step. Closer, his expression unchanged. "I've dealt with men like you before. You're out of your depth." In the tense silence that followed, the men surrounding the leader began to exchange uneasy glances, their bravado slipping. The air was thick with the realization that they had made a mistake, and that mistake was about to cost them. The leader and his men now realize the danger they've walked into, but it's too late to back out. James Carter, a man they thought they could overpower, stands before them, a force to be reckoned with the skills and training of a Delta Force commander. James is more than capable of defending his land and making sure these men learn a lesson they won't soon forget. But what will James do next? Will he take the fight to them, or will he show them mercy? Full Chapter 2. The silence that followed James's last words was thick, heavy with the weight of the tension in the air. The men surrounding him seemed to freeze, their postures stiffening as they realized the gravity of the situation. What had started as an attempted robbery, a simple raid on what they had assumed was an unsuspecting farmer's land, had suddenly taken a very different turn. James Carter, still standing on his porch, his posture unwavering, wasn't just a farmer. He wasn't just a quiet black man in the middle of nowhere. He was someone who had seen the worst of humanity, someone who had been trained to confront danger head-on. And now, these men who had underestimated him were faced with the deadly reality of their mistake. The leader, who had earlier been so confident, now looked visibly shaken. His large hands fidgeted, his gaze flicking nervously between James and his crew. His bravado had all but evaporated, replaced by a sinking fear that none of his threats or insults could cover up. I don't know who you think you are," the leader stammered, trying to regain some semblance of control. "But you don't scare us. We outnumber you. You're alone out here." James didn't move a muscle. His eyes, however, never left the leader's face, calm, unfazed, a steady calm that seemed to strip away the man's bluster, leaving only the raw truth of the situation. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," James said softly, his voice colder than before. "You're not just trespassing on my property, you're trespassing on my peace." There was a long pause before the voice spoke again, now with a hint of concern. "What's going on, James? I thought you'd left all that behind." "I did," James said, his voice low, "but it's come back to find me. I need to make sure my farm is protected. I need people who know how to handle things the right way." Another pause. Then the voice responded, now tinged with both disbelief and admiration. "You're asking for help to fight a raid, right? This isn't just some local trouble you've got going on. You've got real problems, Carter." "I'm not asking for much," James said. "I just need a few men who know what they're doing. You know what's at stake." The voice on the other end of the line let out a slow breath, a sound that was part hesitation, part decision. "I'll make a few calls, get you the help you need, but you know this is going to bring a lot of heat, right? You've been out of the game for a while and things have changed. You sure you want to do this?" James stood up from his desk, his hand gripping the edge of the wooden table. "I've made my decision. I'm not going to sit here and wait for them to come back and finish what they started. Whatever happens, I'm going to defend this land." "I'll get back to you soon," the voice replied, and with that, the call ended. The following days were spent preparing for the worst. James didn't sleep much, his mind constantly running through scenarios and possible outcomes. He had expected to live a quiet life after his military service, but life had a way of pulling you back in, no matter how much you tried to escape. Every morning he checked the perimeter of his farm, making sure that no one else had come close. His senses were heightened, constantly scanning the horizon. He had long since stopped seeing this place as a peaceful retreat. Now it was a fortress, a place to protect at all costs. By the time his contact returned with the help he needed, James had everything in place. The group was small, only a handful of highly trained individuals, all former soldiers, some with experience in combat zones far worse than this. But it was enough. James wasn't going to make the mistake of underestimating his enemies again. As the team settled in, setting up their operations, James felt the old adrenaline rush that he had long ago learned to suppress. The urgency of the situation was clear. The men who had raided his farm weren't going to stop, and he couldn't afford to let them. But there was something else that kept pushing him forward, the desire to ensure that no one else would ever feel the fear that he had felt when his land had been invaded. He walked through the makeshift command center, checking the equipment, making sure everything was ready. There was no room for mistakes now. The mission was simple: protect the farm, eliminate the threat, and make sure these men never returned. As night fell, James sat by the window of the farmhouse, watching the moonlight cast shadows across the land. The farm was still, but in that stillness, he could feel the storm brewing. The men would come again. He knew that for certain. And when they did, they would find a very different James Carter waiting for them. He wasn't the man they thought he was. They thought they were dealing with a simple farmer, but James Carter had fought wars, had commanded special operations, and had seen the world at its darkest. They had underestimated him, and that was going to be their downfall. He leaned back in his chair, a deep breath filling his lungs. The farm was his, and he would protect it with everything he had. The stage is set, and the team is ready. But as the night deepens, James's sense of anticipation grows. The men who raided his farm are still out there, and they won't stop until they get what they came for. But James has prepared for this moment. The confrontation is coming, and when it does, it will be a fight like no other. Full Chapter 4. The calm of the morning was deceptive. The sun rose over the farm, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the fields. But James knew that this serenity was fleeting. There was a storm brewing, one that would hit sooner than any of them could prepare for. The men who had raided his farm would return. They would test him again. But James wasn't going to wait for them to come to him. He had already made his move. For the last few days, James and his small team had been working non-stop. Every corner of the farm was being fortified, every possible entry point covered. The barn was stocked with supplies, and makeshift barricades were being erected along the perimeter. The team worked in silence, the air thick with purpose. No one was here for small talk. They all understood the stakes. As James surveyed the farm, his mind wandered back to his training. He had learned to think strategically, to calculate every move, to anticipate the enemy's next step. His past, as a Delta Force commander, had prepared him for moments like this. Moments when the odds were stacked against him, when everything he had was on the line. He could still hear the sounds of the battlefield in his mind. The rapid fire, gunshots, the crackle of comms, the adrenaline surging through his veins. But that was a different time, a time when the mission was about more than just survival. This time, the mission was personal. These men weren't just strangers, they were intruders, trying to take from him what he had fought to protect. They thought they could come onto his land and take what they wanted without consequence. But they hadn't counted on him. The team had set up positions around the perimeter, each man stationed at strategic points along the property. James had chosen his men carefully. These weren't just regular soldiers. They were experts in their field, each with a unique set of skills honed in dangerous places. They were trained to handle situations like this, and their loyalty to James was unwavering. They weren't just here to help him defend his land. They were here to ensure that these men would never threaten him again. James checked his gear one last time. The rifle slung over his shoulder, the sidearm secured at his waist, and the combat knife tucked safely in his boot. Everything he needed to survive was within reach. He wasn't just prepared for a confrontation, he was prepared to end it on his terms. Walking across the farm to check in with his team, James noticed the silence around him. The usual sounds of nature, the rustling of the trees, the distant calls of birds had gone quiet. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come, the calm before the storm. He met with his second-in-command, a quiet but experienced former soldier named Daniel. "All set?" James asked, his voice calm, betraying none of the anxiety that had been building inside him. Daniel nodded. "We've got eyes on every entry point. They won't get through without us knowing. The traps are set and everyone's in position." "Good," James replied. "We'll stick to the plan. No surprises." The two of them exchanged a look, and for a moment the weight of the situation was clear. They both knew that this was the point of no return. Once the fight started, there would be no stopping it. But James wasn't afraid. This was what he had trained for. The mission had changed, but the approach was the same. Neutralize the threat, secure the objective, and ensure that the enemy never had a chance to win. As the sun climbed higher, James found himself standing by the farmhouse, looking out over the land. His mind drifted to the years he had spent in combat, the quiet moments before every mission when he would stand just like this, looking out over the battlefield, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. But this wasn't a battlefield, this was home. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind him. It was his youngest recruit, Alex, who had been quiet ever since he'd arrived. The kid was new to this line of work, but James could see the potential in him. He had the instincts, the focus. He just needed experience. "Everything's ready, sir," Alex said, standing stiffly. "I've checked the traps, and the team's in position, but what happens if they don't show up today?" James turned, his eyes meeting the young soldiers. "They'll show up," he said firmly. "They don't make threats and then walk away. They've come this far. Now it's just a matter of time before they make their move. When they do, we'll be ready." Alex nodded, though his face showed some hesitation. "But if they have backup, they will," James interrupted, his voice calm but with a hard edge. "These men aren't amateurs, but neither are we. I know the land better than anyone, and I've prepared for every possibility. We just need to hold our ground." Alex seemed reassured, but James could see the unease in his eyes. It was a reminder of how much was at stake, not just for James, but for the men who had come to help him. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a fight for dignity, for the right to live in peace without fear of being hunted. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened and the temperature dropped. The atmosphere was tense, every shadow seeming to stretch further across the land. James couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. His instincts, honed over years of combat, were telling him that the men would come tonight. He walked back to the farmhouse, his thoughts racing. The men who had raided his farm had underestimated him once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. but he had no intention of giving them a second chance. This time, when they showed up, they would find a different man waiting for them, a man who had faced worse odds and come out alive. As the evening settled in, James took one last look at the farmhouse. He could feel the weight of the coming battle, but he was ready. The farm would remain his. No one would take it from him. He turned to the team, gathered at their positions, their faces set with determination. "Stay sharp," James said, his voice commanding. "When they show up, we're taking control. This is our land, and we're not backing down." The first truck appeared at the edge of the farm, its headlights cutting through the darkening sky. James's heart rate quickened, but his focus never wavered. The enemy was here. The battle was about to begin. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and electric. Every man on the team was in position, waiting for the signal. James didn't move, his eyes locked on the approaching vehicles. They thought they could take his land. They thought they could intimidate him. They were wrong. The trucks have arrived. The men who raided James's farm are back, and they have no idea what they're about to face. The stage is set for the final showdown, and James knows that this will be a fight to the death. The question now is whether the enemy will survive this time, or whether James will finally be able to protect what's his, no matter the cost. Full Chapter 5. The headlights of the trucks cut through the night like daggers, their beam harsh and unforgiving. James didn't move. He stood still, his eyes fixed on the vehicles as they crept closer to the farm, each one rumbling with purpose, the sound of their engines growing louder with every second. The men who had come to his farm once before were back, but this time they weren't going to find an easy victim. James had made sure of that. He glanced over his shoulder, catching the eyes of his team. They were ready, each man poised in their positions, watching the road ahead with laser-like focus. There were no second chances now. They had trained for this, prepared for this moment. James knew that once the first shot was fired, there would be no turning back. The farm, his land, was under threat, and he was going to do whatever it took to protect it. The trucks finally came into full view, their tires kicking up dust as they made their way down the long driveway. James could see the figures inside, the same group of men who had raided his farm before. They had returned more determined than ever, thinking they could take what they wanted without consequence. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. James clenched his fists at his sides, feeling the weight of his training, the years of combat experience that now came to the forefront. He wasn't just a farmer anymore. He was a fighter, a commander, and these men were about to learn just how dangerous it was to mess with someone like him. The trucks pulled to a stop just outside the gates. The leader, the same man who had confronted James last time, stepped out first, a smug look on his face. He scanned the farm, his eyes narrowing as they landed on James standing in the distance. "You really think you can stop us, don't you?" the leader called out, his voice loud and challenging. He wasn't wearing the bravado he had before. Now there was a touch of uncertainty in his eyes, but the arrogance remained. James didn't respond. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his movements deliberate, steady. His gaze never wavered from the leader's face. The tension between them was palpable, the air thick with the promise of violence. "You've made a mistake," James finally said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of experience. "This is your last warning. Turn around, leave, or things will get a lot worse for you." The leader's face twisted in disbelief. "You're really going to stand there and act like you can do anything about it?" He motioned to his men. "We've got you outnumbered. You've got nowhere to go." James didn't flinch. His training kicked in and his mind went into overdrive. He could hear the slightest shifts in the air, the faintest sound of boots scraping against gravel. His team was in position, ready to move at a moment's notice. The traps were set. The farm had become a maze, a gauntlet that the men didn't know they would have to navigate. James knew he had the upper hand. They thought they were in control, but they hadn't realized how much he had prepared for this. "You're wrong," James said simply. "You don't control anything here." Without another word, he turned and made his way toward the barn, his team following his every movement. The leader and his men were left standing there, confused and slightly rattled by the quiet confidence that James exuded. They had underestimated him, and now they were about to pay the price. The first shot rang out, sharp and clear in the dead of night. It wasn't a shot fired by James, but by one of his men stationed at the farthest perimeter. The sound echoed through the air, breaking the silence like a clap of thunder. The leader's head snapped toward the noise, his eyes widening in panic. But it was too late. Within seconds, the farm erupted into chaos. The men who had thought they were in control now found themselves scrambling, their movements erratic, as they tried to figure out where the shots were coming from. The traps James had set, tripwires, snares, and concealed positions, activated one by one, catching them off guard. Another shot, fired from a hidden position, taking out one of the men who had been moving too close to the barn. He fell with a muffled grunt, his body hitting the ground hard. Panic began to set in as the raiders realized they were not facing an easy target. The leader barked orders, trying to rally his men, but his voice faltered. James could see the fear now, clear in their eyes. They had expected an easy raid, but what they hadn't anticipated was the deadly precision with which James and his team had set their trap. James moved quickly, his steps measured as he navigated the farm. He was no longer a farmer, he was a soldier, a strategist, and he was taking back control. His mind moved with speed, calculating every move, every shot, every possibility. He reached the barn and peered around the corner, his rifle raised. Through the shadows, he saw the men scrambling, some attempting to retreat, others still trying to make their way toward the farmhouse. But they were out of their depth. Every time they tried to advance, they were met with resistance. Every attempt to make their move was thwarted by the traps, the positions, and the men who knew the land better than they did. As the battle raged on, the leader finally seemed to snap. He ordered his men to fall back, but it was too late. James had already anticipated their retreat. With a few quick hand signals, his team moved into position, cutting off their escape routes. The leader, realizing the situation was quickly spiraling out of control, turned to run. But James was already there, stepping out from behind a tree, blocking his path. "You're not going anywhere," James said, his voice as cold as steel. The leader froze, his body tensing. For a moment, neither of them moved. It was a standoff, the final moment of reckoning. The leader's breath quickened, and James could see the fear in his eyes. The man had pushed too far, and now there was no escape. "You made a mistake coming here," James said, "and you're going to pay for it." With a swift, decisive move, James disarmed the leader, knocking the rifle from his hands and sending it flying into the dirt. The leader dropped to his knees, breathing heavily, his face a mask of defeat. The remaining men, seeing their leader captured, hesitated. They were beaten, broken, and outmatched. James had made his point. The farm was his, and anyone who tried to take it would face the consequences. As the last of the raiders were disarmed and secured, James surveyed the scene. The adrenaline of the fight had worn off, and now, in the quiet aftermath, all that was left was the weight of what had happened. He had fought for his land, for his peace, and he had won. Though the battle is over, the scars of the fight remain. The men who raided James's farm have been dealt with, but there are others out there who may come after him. The war for his land is far from over. James has won this round, but the question remains. Will he be able to keep his peace, or will the cycle of violence repeat? Full Chapter 6. The silence after the battle was deafening. The chaos had calmed, the sounds of gunfire and shouting now replaced with the eerie stillness of a farm that had been temporarily broken by violence. James stood amidst the wreckage, his breath steady as he surveyed the scene around him. The men who had come to raid his farm were either captured or scattered. The leader, the one who had underestimated James the most, was tied up in the back of the barn, sitting in the dirt, his eyes filled with a mix of defeat and disbelief. The others had either been disarmed or taken down, their arrogance now replaced with the bitter taste of failure. James didn't feel relief. Not yet. The fight wasn't over. He knew it. There was too much at stake. The fear he had seen in the raiders' eyes wasn't just about them realizing they had made a mistake. It was about something larger, something far more dangerous. Though air smelled faintly of gunpowder, and the night was still young. The moon hung high in the sky, casting its pale light over the land, a stark reminder of the events that had just unfolded. James hadn't allowed himself to fully process the fight. He knew that, right now, the priority was ensuring the farm was safe, ensuring that no one else would try to take it. Walking back to the farmhouse, James passed by the trap that had worked flawlessly. A snare hidden among the tall grass, meant to catch the raiders off guard. It had worked, but that success came at a cost. There were broken fences, some scattered equipment, and signs of the raid's destructive force that would take time to repair. His team moved with quiet precision, securing the prisoners, collecting weapons, and ensuring there was no immediate danger. James knew that with the raiders incapacitated, there was time to breathe, but only for a moment. "You good?" Daniel, his second-in-command, asked as he approached James from the side. His expression was grim, but his eyes held the quiet respect of a man who understood the gravity of the situation. James nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. "Yeah, but this isn't over. They'll be back, and when they do, it won't be just a handful of men." Daniel didn't ask for more details. He knew what James meant. This group, this ragtag crew, wasn't working alone. They were part of something bigger. James could feel it. The men weren't just acting on their own, they were connected to something far more dangerous. And now, with the farm under threat, James was right in the middle of it. As the team gathered around the captured raiders, James began to question the leader. He was sitting against the barn wall, his arms bound tightly behind him. The smug confidence that had been so prevalent earlier had completely evaporated. Now he was just a man, caught and vulnerable. James crouched down in front of him, his eyes sharp. "Why did you come here?" he asked quietly. The leader didn't answer immediately. Instead, he spat on the ground, his eyes flicking toward the rest of his team, who were being held by other members of the team. His pride had been shattered, and he wasn't willing to give James the satisfaction of an answer. "You came here for a reason," James pressed, his voice low but commanding. "What were you after? Money? Land?" The leader sneered, but there was something behind his eyes. Fear. He knew he was losing. "We're not alone," he muttered, his voice thick with bitterness. "This wasn't about money. You think you're safe here, but you're just a blip in a much bigger picture." James's heart rate picked up. That wasn't just a defiant comment. It was a warning. The leader had just confirmed what James had suspected. There was more to this than a simple raid. "Who are you working for?" James asked, his tone harder now. The leader didn't respond, but James didn't need him to. He could tell from the look in his eyes that the man was afraid. Afraid of the people behind him. Afraid of what they would do if he talked. But James wasn't going to let him off that easily. "If you want to walk away from this alive, you'll start talking. Otherwise, I'll make sure you regret it." The leader's eyes flicked nervously to his men, who were being restrained nearby. He seemed to be weighing his options, but James's presence was a constant, silent pressure. Finally, after a long pause, the leader let out a long, drawn-out sigh. "It's not over, you'll see," he muttered. "There are people who want this land, people with power, people who don't care who you are. They'll come for you." James stood up, letting the silence hang in the air. He didn't need to hear the rest of the leader's cryptic warnings. It was clear now that this wasn't a simple raid. The men who had come to his farm were just pawns in a much larger game. His mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario. There were wealthy, powerful figures involved, people who had the resources to cause real trouble. And James had just exposed himself as a threat. As he turned away from the leader, Daniel stepped up beside him. "What now?" he asked, his voice tight. James's gaze lingered on the men, now defeated and bound. And then he looked out across the farm. The sun had disappeared completely, leaving the farm in darkness. "We prepare," James said, his voice low. "We fortify, and we wait for them to make their next move." The days that followed were filled with tension. James and his team worked tirelessly to strengthen the farm's defenses. Every day brought more signs that the raid was just the beginning. The mysterious force behind the attack was still out there, and they weren't going to stop just because. James had fought back. Late one night, after hours of checking the perimeter and ensuring the safety of his land, James sat alone on the porch of the farmhouse. The stars above were scattered like diamonds in the sky. But the tranquility of the scene did little to ease his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the calm before the storm. His hand rested on the worn handle of his rifle, the weight of it comforting in a strange way. He had been in worse situations before, but this one felt different. This time, it wasn't just his life on the line, it was his land, his future, and the future of those who had helped him get to this point. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Daniel approaching. "They're gone," Daniel said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "The last of them. We've secured the area." James nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. "It's not over. We're just getting started." The aftermath of the raid has left James with more questions than answers. The leader's warning and his cryptic message hint at a much larger, more dangerous force behind the attack. James has defended his land for now, but he knows this isn't the end. The real battle is only just beginning, and the cost of protecting what's his may be higher than he ever imagined. Full Chapter 7. The night was quiet again, but James knew better than to let the silence fool him. The air was thick with something, unspoken, an unease that lingered in every shadow, every crackle of the wind against the trees, every slight movement in the darkness set his senses on edge. The farm, which had once been a peaceful sanctuary, now felt like a battlefield. James sat in his office, the dim light from the desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. His rifle was propped up against the desk, and his hand rested lightly on it. He hadn't let it out of arm's reach since the raid. His eyes were fixed on the map of the surrounding area, his thoughts drifting back to the words of the leader. He hadn't been just a common thug. There was something else, something bigger at play. "They'll come for you," the leader had said. "There are people who want this land, people with power." Who were these people? What was their stake? In his farm, he had assumed that the raid had been about simple robbery, about taking what they thought was easy to steal. But now, it was clear that there was a much larger game at play. The leader's words had struck a chord deep within him. Power, influence. These weren't the things of a simple farm raid. These were the words of a network, a web of people who saw his land as a means to an end. James's mind raced as he thought through every possibility. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. But they didn't form a picture he wanted to see. He could feel the walls closing in around him, and he knew that the threat wasn't just external. There were forces at work in the shadows, forces that didn't just want his land. They wanted to erase everything about him, his history, and everything he had worked for. He rubbed his temples, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He had been through wars, fought enemies who were far more dangerous than anything he could imagine here. But this was different. This wasn't a mission with clear objectives or a defined enemy. This was a fight against an invisible enemy, a fight against people who hid behind power and influence. The next morning, as dawn broke over the farm, James made his way outside to check on his team. The early morning chill still hung in the air, and the ground beneath his boots crunched with every step. The farm had become his fortress, but even the most fortified defenses wouldn't keep him safe if he didn't understand the true nature of the threat. Daniel was waiting by the perimeter, scanning the fields through a pair of binoculars. His sharp eyes caught James's approach, and he nodded, signaling for him to join him. "We've got movement," Daniel said quietly, his voice low but urgent. "I've been monitoring the roads. Looks like a few vehicles have been circling the area. Not just the raiders from last night, this is different. These vehicles are coming from the other side of the ridge." James narrowed his eyes, his instincts flaring. The ridge was on the far side of the farm, beyond the tree line. It was isolated, and few people ever ventured out that way. It was a prime route for anyone trying to approach undetected. "Who are they?" James asked, his voice tight. Daniel shook his head. "I don't know. But whoever they are, they're moving too deliberately. They know the area, and they're not acting like amateurs." James felt his stomach twist. This was exactly what he had feared. The raiders from the previous night had been just the beginning. There were others out there, others who knew exactly what they were doing, and they were moving closer with each passing day. "I want you to check the area again," James said, his voice sharp. "We need to know exactly who's coming through there, no mistakes." Daniel nodded, turning to leave, but James stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Be careful," James added, his eyes hard. "We're not dealing with just some local thugs. This is something bigger. You keep your head on a swivel." Daniel gave him a brief, respectful nod before heading off toward the ridge, his silhouette disappearing into the morning fog. James spent the next few hours going over the farm's defenses once again, double-checking everything. His mind kept returning to the cryptic words of the leader, the way he had spoken about people with power. The men who had raided his farm weren't just acting on their own. They were part of something much larger. James had been in enough battles to know that when you fought an enemy like this, you didn't just have to watch your back. You had to watch every direction. You had to anticipate every move they might make. His thoughts were interrupted when Daniel returned, his expression grim. "I didn't find anything conclusive," Daniel said, "but I've been hearing rumors. Some locals are saying that there's been talk about the land around here, and they're not just talking about the farm itself. They're talking about the whole region. There are a lot of people interested in buying up land around here." James looked at him, his mind spinning. "Who's behind it?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know, but I did hear one name mentioned. It's a man named Richard Graves. He's been buying up land in the area for years. People don't know much about him, but they say he's got connections, big ones." James's blood ran cold. Richard Graves. The name sounded familiar, but James couldn't place it immediately. Then it hit him. Graves wasn't just any businessman. He was a man with a history, a man who had used his wealth and influence to acquire land, to buy his way into power. A man who wouldn't hesitate to take what he wanted by force if necessary. James ran his hand through his hair, frustration and anger rising in his chest. This wasn't just some isolated raid. This was about land, about power, about control, and Graves was at the center of it all. As the day dragged on, James continued to think about what Daniel had uncovered. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. He needed to learn more about Graves, about who he was and what he wanted. The threat wasn't just from the men who had raided his farm. It was from the men pulling the strings behind the scenes. That night, after the team had settled in, James sat alone at the table, reviewing the maps again. His mind was focused, his eyes tracing the lines of the property, the land surrounding it, and the potential escape routes. But it wasn't just the land he was focused on anymore. It was the people who wanted it. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. A voice picked up on the other end. "This is Carter," James said, his voice steady. "I need a favor. I need everything you can find on a man named Richard Graves." James is diving deeper into the web of power and influence that threatens not just his farm, but his very existence. Richard Graves is the key, but what James doesn't know is that Graves's reach is longer and more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. As James digs into Graves's past, he realizes that this fight is going to cost him more than he ever thought. Full Chapter 8. The weight of the phone call with his contact still hung over James as he sat in the dim light of his office. The sound of the wind rattling the windows of the farmhouse. Richard Graves wasn't just a name. He was a symbol of everything James had fought against. The kind of man who used his power to manipulate, to control, and to acquire whatever he wanted without consequence. And now, James had unknowingly become a part of his game. James stared at the glowing map on his desk, tracing the lines of the surrounding area. Graves had been quietly purchasing land for years, slowly building his empire, and James's farm had become just another piece in his sprawling network. But the question still lingered. Why his farm? Why now? The answers were just out of reach, and James wasn't a man who liked waiting for things to come to him. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. This wasn't just about protecting his land anymore. It was about survival. The first step was clear. He needed to learn everything he could about Graves, and fast. James had a network of people he trusted, people who could dig deep into the shadows and uncover the truth. He pulled out his phone again, dialing a number he hadn't called in years, a former colleague from his time in Delta Force, a man who had connections and who knew how to get information when it wasn't supposed to be found. The phone rang once, twice, before a familiar voice answered. "Carter?" The voice was rough, gruff, but it carried a note of recognition. "It's been a while. What do you need?" James leaned back in his chair, glancing out the window at the sprawling fields outside. "I need everything you can find on a man named Richard Graves. He's buying up land around my property, and I need to know who he is, what he wants, and what kind of influence he's got." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a low chuckle. "Graves, huh? You're stepping into deep water, Carter. This isn't a man you mess with. But I'll get you what you need." "I don't have time to waste," James said, his voice clipped, his urgency clear. "You'll have it in a few hours," his contact replied. "But don't expect to like what you hear. Graves isn't some local businessman. He's got ties, connections that run deep. Stay on your toes. I'll be ready." The line clicked dead, and James sat back, his fingers tapping lightly. On the desk, he had known from the start that this wasn't just about raiders trying to take his land. This was about power. And Graves wasn't just any player in the game. He was at the top, pulling the strings of men, like the ones who had raided James's farm. A few hours later, James received the call. His contact's voice was grim when he spoke. "You were right to be worried. Graves has ties to some pretty powerful people. I'm talking real power, the kind that doesn't like to be seen. He's been buying up land for years, but it's not just about making money, it's about control. The land he's acquiring, it's all connected to water rights, energy projects, and transportation hubs. He's consolidating power in this region, and he's doing it quietly, behind closed doors." James felt a cold chill run through him as the pieces started to fall into place. This wasn't just about land. This was about controlling resources, controlling the future of the entire region. "You need to watch yourself, Carter. the voice on the phone continued. Graves isn't the kind of guy who lets anyone get in his way. He's got politicians, businessmen, and even law enforcement under his thumb. He's more than just a wealthy landowner. He's building something that could make him untouchable. James felt the weight of the information settle over him. He wasn't just up against a group of raiders or a few men looking to steal from him. He was facing a powerful man who had built a network of influence that stretched beyond his farm and into the corridors of power. "How do I stop him?" James asked, his voice hard with resolve. "You don't," the voice replied. "Not easily, anyway. Graves plays the long game. He's not some guy you take down with a few quick moves. But if you want to make a dent, you got to start digging into his operations, expose his ties, his investments. People like Graves don't like being seen in the light. Find the cracks, and you might have a shot." James leaned forward, his mind racing. He had spent his life fighting battles in places where the odds were stacked against him, but this was different. He was fighting against a man who had the resources to make anyone disappear. A man who had the power to control everything from the shadows. But James wasn't afraid. He had faced tougher odds before, and he wasn't about to let this man take everything he had fought for. Over the next few days, James continued to dig. He worked with his contact, gathering as much intel as possible. The more he uncovered about Graves, the more his suspicions were confirmed. Graves wasn't just a businessman. He was a puppet master, controlling not just land, but entire industries. His grip stretched into every facet of life in the region, from politics to law enforcement to energy and agriculture. But there was a problem. Every time James thought he was getting close to something concrete, the trail would go cold. Graves was too well protected, too deeply embedded in the system. The more James dug, the more dangerous the situation became. It wasn't just his farm at risk anymore. It was everything. One evening, after a long day of digging through papers and tracking down leads, James sat alone in his office, staring at the map of his farm and the surrounding area. He had been so focused on the external threat, the men who had come to raid his farm, that he had overlooked the bigger picture. The enemy wasn't just outside his farm. The enemy was everywhere. As the night deepened, James received another call, this time from Daniel. "We've got movement," Daniel said, his voice tight. "It looks like Graves's men are making their way toward the property again." James's heart skipped a beat. He had known this was coming. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. "I'll be ready," James said, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of urgency. The following night, as James prepared for what he knew would be another confrontation, his mind kept returning to the information he had uncovered about Richard Graves. The man was powerful, untouchable, but not for long. James had a plan, and it was time to execute it. The fight was far from over, and James wasn't about to back down. He wasn't just defending his land anymore. He was fighting for something bigger. He was fighting for the truth. Graves's men are on their way, and James knows that the battle is about to escalate. He's uncovered the extent of Graves's power, but the more he learns, the more dangerous the situation becomes. Can James find a way to expose the truth without losing everything? Or will he be crushed by the very system he's trying to take down? Full Chapter 9. The night had come far too quickly. James stood at the window of the farmhouse, staring out over the land that had once been his sanctuary. The fields, now familiar to him as his home, seemed almost foreign tonight. A battlefield. A place under siege. The calmness of the evening had been shattered by the knowledge that Graves's men were on their way, and this time James wasn't sure he could keep them at bay for long. The phone rang. It was Daniel. "We've spotted them," Daniel said, without preamble. "A group of about 8 vehicles heading straight for your farm. They're moving fast, and it looks like they're not coming for a conversation." James's grip tightened around the phone. "I figured as much. Prepare the team. We've got one chance to stop them, and we need to hit them hard." Daniel hesitated for a moment. "James, they've got reinforcements, and it's not just a few hired hands. These men are military trained. They know what they're doing." James closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. He had been expecting this, but knowing it was coming didn't make it any easier. "I'm not running," James said, his voice cold with resolve. "I'm not going to let them take what's mine. We'll hold the line." "Understood," Daniel replied. "We're with you, no matter what." James hung up the phone and looked around his office. Maps of the farm were pinned to the wall, but they weren't just for defense anymore. They were part of a plan to take the fight to them. Every part of the property had been mapped out, every corner accounted for. He had fortified every weakness, but now he needed to think beyond just protecting what was his. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice. He pulled on his jacket and stepped outside, the night air cool and crisp against his skin. His team was already moving into position, their faces hard with determination. They had come to help him, but now they were all in the fight for the same reason: to stop Graves and his men from taking what they had no right to. James looked around at his team. A handful of men who had been through hell with him, men who had fought in foreign lands, men who knew how to handle themselves in the face of danger. They were ready for what was coming. But James knew this was different. This wasn't some battlefield halfway around the world. This was his land, and it was under threat. The first sound that broke the silence of the night was the distant roar of engines. James's heart skipped a beat. The time had come. "We've got company," Daniel's voice crackled through the comms. James's eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon. There were no lights, no signals, just the shadows of approaching vehicles, their headlights cutting through. The night like a blade, it was a stark contrast to the peaceful stillness that had once defined his farm. As the vehicles neared, James gave the signal. His team moved into position with practiced precision, taking up defensive spots around the farm. They weren't just trying to defend against a raid anymore, they were setting up a trap. "Hold your fire," James ordered through his earpiece, his voice steady. "Wait for my signal." The engines grew louder, the sound reverberating through the land, making the hair on the back of James's neck stand up. He knew that in a few moments everything would change. The first vehicle pulled into view, a large truck with a group of armed men in the back. They slowed down as they neared the gate, unsure of what to expect. James could see the men inside, scanning the area, their eyes darting from left to right, looking for signs of resistance. But they couldn't see what James had already planned. He watched as the truck came closer, his finger hovering over the trigger. The tension in the air was thick enough to slice through. The men in the truck hadn't noticed the tripwires set along the road, wires that would trigger a series of explosive charges hidden just off the path. It was a simple setup, but it was effective. It would buy them time. "Now," James whispered to himself. The first shot rang out, not from James, but from one of his men positioned at the far edge of the field. The explosive charges went off, creating a loud, concussive blast that shook the ground beneath their feet. The truck jerked to a halt, the men inside ducking instinctively as the blast echoed across the land. It was a clear signal. This fight was on. The raiders were caught off guard. James's team opened fire from multiple positions, hitting the men in the truck with precise shots, incapacitating them before they could even respond. The battle had started, but James knew it was far from over. The trucks screeched to a halt. As men poured out, weapons raised, but they were met with heavy resistance. The farm had become a battlefield, and James was at the center of it all, commanding his team with precision. They were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of terrain, of knowing the land better than anyone else. James was everywhere at once, moving from one position to another, checking on his men, barking orders through the comms. The raiders were fighting back fiercely, but their confusion was evident. They hadn't expected to face this kind of resistance, and their panic was showing. James's mind raced, calculating every move, every angle. He could see the larger picture now. This wasn't just about stopping a raid. This was about taking control of the situation and sending a message to Graves and anyone else who thought they could intimidate him. As he made his way to the farmhouse, he caught sight of Daniel, who was crouched behind a barricade. "We've got a few more men coming in," Daniel said, his voice tight. "They're trying to flank us from the east." James nodded. "Hold the line," he ordered. "We can't let them get any closer." The battle raged on, gunfire echoing. Through the night, the staccato of shots mixing with the sounds of explosions, and the screams of men caught in the chaos. But amidst it all, James remained focused. This was what he had trained for. This was his moment. The final blow came when James and his team managed to push the raiders back, cutting off their retreat and forcing them to surrender. The men who had come to his farm were beaten, broken, and captured. They had underestimated him, and now they would learn the price of that mistake. As the last of the raiders was secured, James took a deep breath, his heart still pounding in his chest. The fight had been long, but it was over. For now. He surveyed the field, the wreckage of the battle around him. The farm, once again, stood strong, but James knew the truth. This fight wasn't over. Graves wasn't the kind of man who would back down easily. James had won this battle, but there were more to come. Though the battle has ended for now, the real war is just beginning. The men who came to James's farm have been defeated, but the unseen force behind them, Richard Graves, remains a looming threat. James knows that the next battle will be even harder, but he's prepared to face whatever comes his way, no matter the cost. Full Chapter 10. The smoke from the gunfire still lingered in the cool night air, the remnants of a battle that had left its mark not just on the land, but on James himself. He stood in the middle of the farm, his eyes scanning the damage, the broken fences, the abandoned vehicles, the men who had once thought they could take what was his, now lying defeated and disarmed. But the cost of the victory was evident. His hands trembled slightly, and the sharp sting in his shoulder reminded him that he had been in a fight for his life, one that had pushed him to the brink. He had fought with everything he had, and now, as the adrenaline slowly wore off, the toll of it all began to sink in. James had been through wars, had fought enemies far more dangerous than the ones who had come to his farm, but this was different. This was personal. His mind drifted back to the moments before the fight, when he had stood on his porch, looking out over the land, knowing what was coming. He had fought to protect it. But now, standing amidst the aftermath, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was no end in sight. He had won, yes, but what did it really mean? The team was still securing the prisoners, making sure they couldn't escape or cause any more damage. James didn't need to say much. His team knew what had to be done. They had been through too much together to need instructions. They had fought beside him, and now they were standing with him, their loyalty unwavering. But even as they moved through the wreckage, James could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The victory felt hollow, like a fleeting moment in the midst of a much larger storm. The men who had come to his farm were defeated for now, but their mission wasn't over. And the man behind it all, Richard Graves, was still out there. James's hand brushed against the rifle slung over his shoulder. It had been his constant companion through the battle. But it wasn't just the weapon that was weighing on him. It was the decisions he had made, the choices he had forced his team to make. The men they had taken down, The lives that had been lost, it was all starting to hit him now. James had always known that his military career came with a cost, that every decision he made would have consequences. But back then, the fight was always for a greater cause, a cause he believed in. Now, as he stood here on his own land, he had to ask himself if the fight was really worth it. Was he fighting for his land, for his peace, or was he fighting for something more? A need to prove that he could still win, even when the odds were stacked against him. He walked back to the farmhouse, his mind heavy with the burden of his thoughts. The lights inside were dim, but the shadows felt like they were closing in around him. His hand rested on the doorframe as he entered, his eyes scanning the familiar space. This house had once been a symbol of peace, a sanctuary from the horrors of the world. Now, it felt like a war zone. He walked over to the small desk in the corner and sat down, his shoulders slumped. The events of the night seemed to replay in his mind over and over again. The shots, the explosions, the sound of his team moving through the farm, cutting off the raiders' retreat. He had been in the thick of it, a commander once again, making decisions on the fly, keeping his team alive. But the emotional cost was starting to settle in. Was this the life he had fought for? Was this the peace he had wanted? The silence of the farmhouse was broken by a knock at the door. James sighed, pushing himself out of the chair. He had known it was coming. The team would need to debrief. The prisoners would need to be interrogated. But there was something else hanging in the air, a question that lingered in his mind. What would happen next? He opened the door to find Daniel standing in the doorway, his face tired but resolute. "You okay?" Daniel asked, his voice low, as if he already knew the answer. James nodded slowly. "Yeah, just thinking." Daniel stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "You know we've got a lot of work to do, right? We can't just sit back and relax now. They'll come again. Graves's men are persistent." James ran a hand over his face, exhaustion weighing heavily on him. "I know. But I can't keep doing this, Daniel. I can't keep fighting like this, like I'm still in the field. I thought this was supposed to be over, but now it feels like it's just beginning." Daniel's gaze softened, and he stepped forward, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "You've got a team here. We're not just here to fight for the farm. We're here to fight for you, but you've got to let us help you. We're in this together." James met his eyes, his expression hard. "I appreciate that, Daniel, I do. But this isn't just about fighting for the farm anymore. This is about something bigger. This is about stopping Graves, about exposing what he's doing, and stopping him before he takes everything." Daniel nodded. "And we'll do that, but first we need to make sure this farm is safe. We need to stay ahead of Graves and his men. We can't afford to let our guard down, not now." James turned away from him, his mind racing. Daniel was right. The fight wasn't over. Graves had to be stopped, but it wasn't just about winning a battle anymore. It was about exposing the corruption and the power that Graves wielded, the way he used his influence to manipulate everyone around him, and James wasn't going to stop until Graves was held accountable for what he had done. The next morning, the sun was bright and clear, but the tension that had filled the air during the battle still lingered. James didn't sleep much, his mind too active, replaying the events of the night. He knew the men who had come to raid. His farm would not stop until they had finished what they had started. The question was, what would he do next? Daniel and the team were already working on securing the prisoners, making sure they couldn't escape or cause more trouble. James walked outside, scanning the land once again, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had fought to protect his farm, but now he was fighting for something far greater. A fight that would require everything he had. And, in the quiet of the morning, with the farm standing still around him, James made a decision. He was going to go after Graves, expose the man's network of influence, and make sure that his reign of power ended before it could destroy everything he had worked for. James's resolve has hardened. He's no longer just defending his land. He's now preparing to take on the man behind the attack, Richard Graves. But the road ahead is fraught with danger. The fight is far from over, and the cost of taking on someone with Graves's power may be higher than James ever imagined. Full Chapter 11. The morning after the raid was quiet. The usual buzz of the farm, the sounds of animals, the rustling of leaves in the wind seemed distant, almost foreign. James stood by the edge of his land, staring out at the horizon, his thoughts a storm of plans and consequences. He had won the battle, but the war was far from over. Richard Graves was still out there, his reach extending farther than James had ever imagined. James had prepared himself for many things in his life, but nothing had ever quite felt like this. A fight against a man who controlled not just the land, but the people, the systems, the very fabric of the power structure. Graves was untouchable, it seemed. And yet, James had no choice but to press on. He turned back toward the farmhouse where his team was already gathered, going through the remains of the previous night's fight. The prisoners were secured, but the real work was just beginning. They needed to know everything about Graves. Every move he had made, every ally he had. James couldn't afford to miss a single detail. He couldn't afford to be wrong. "Daniel," James called as he entered the farmhouse, "we need to start looking deeper. Graves isn't just a businessman, he's a criminal, and we need to prove it." Daniel nodded. "We've got some information already, but it's not enough. We need hard evidence, something that'll make him vulnerable." James felt a surge of frustration. He had faced enemies before, in distant lands. But this was different. Here, he was fighting against a man who was protected by layers of corruption and wealth, a man who could bury anyone who came for him. But James wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. "Get me everything on his business dealings," James said, his voice hard with resolve. "I want to know every property he's bought, every contract he's signed. If we can't take him down through force, then we take him down through exposure." The team worked tirelessly, sorting through papers, files, and any trace of Graves's influence they could find. Daniel coordinated with the others, making sure they had access to the right sources, while James dove deeper into the network of corruption that surrounded the powerful man. The more they uncovered, the darker the picture became. Graves had his hands in everything, from land acquisitions to environmental regulations, from local law enforcement to the highest levels of politics. He had created a web of influence that spread across the region, ensuring that he was untouchable. No one seemed to be able to stand in his way, and James was starting to realize that the people who worked for Graves, his so-called henchmen, weren't the ones pulling the strings. The real power was in the shadows, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy, money, and fear. But James had learned long ago that nothing was truly hidden. Not if you knew where to look. As the days wore on, James's frustration grew. They were getting closer, but it wasn't enough. They needed more. They needed something that would give them the leverage to make Graves vulnerable, to expose the full extent of his criminal empire. James was in the middle of reviewing some files when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but he picked it up anyway. "James Carter," the voice on the other end said, gravelly and low. "I hear you've been asking questions." James sat up straighter, his mind immediately going into overdrive. "Who is this?" "You're looking for Graves. I can help you," the voice said, a slight chuckle following the words. "But it's going to cost you." James's heart raced, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not interested in playing games. Who are you?" The voice paused, and then the words came out with chilling clarity. "Let's just say I'm someone who knows how deep the rabbit hole goes. And if you want to take Graves down, you're going to need my help. It's a small price to pay." James didn't like the sound of this. He didn't trust anyone who spoke like this, someone who seemed to be playing both sides. But he also knew that he didn't have much of a choice. Graves was dangerous, and anyone who could help bring him down was worth considering. "Fine," James said, his voice sharp. "But I want proof. You get me something I can use, and we'll talk." The voice on the other end chuckled again. "You'll have your proof, but I can't give you everything. Not yet. Meet me at the old warehouse on Pine Ridge, midnight, and bring the cash." The line clicked dead before James could respond. He stared at the phone, unsure of what to make of the call. It was risky, and he didn't like the fact that this person knew so much about him and his plans, but in his gut he felt something else. This was the break he'd been waiting for. That night, as James drove toward Pine Ridge, his mind was racing. He had prepared for this moment, but now that it was here, doubts began to creep in. What if this was a trap? What if he was walking right into Graves's hands? But he couldn't afford to second-guess himself now. He needed something to bring Graves down, something that would expose the man's entire operation. If he didn't act, Graves would continue to pull the strings, and James's farm, his home, would be lost. The warehouse came into view, its silhouette dark against the night sky. The place looked abandoned, the windows boarded up, the doors closed tight. James parked a distance away, leaving his truck hidden in the shadows, then made his way toward the building on foot. He kept his hand on the grip of his sidearm, just in case. As he approached the warehouse, a figure stepped out of the darkness. The man was tall, his face obscured by a hood, but there was something in his posture. A sense of authority, a sense of power. He wasn't just another thug. James could tell that this man was someone who operated in the shadows, someone who knew how to get things done. "You're James Carter," the man said, his voice smooth, but with an edge to it. "I've been watching you. You've got more guts than I thought." James didn't respond. He wasn't here for pleasantries. He needed answers. "You've got something for me," James said, his voice hard. "What's your angle?" The man smirked. "Straight to the point, huh? I like that, but let's be clear. I'm not doing this out of the goodness of my heart. You want to take down Graves, but you're going to need help, and I'm the one who can give you what you need." James didn't trust him, but the desperation in his gut made him listen. "I'm listening." The man took a step closer, his hand reaching into his jacket. "You want evidence, Carter? I've got it, but it's going to cost you. There's a price for everything in this world." James is on the edge of uncovering the truth about Richard Graves, but at what cost? The mysterious figure at the warehouse offers him what he needs, but James is left to wonder if he's being led into a trap. The fight is far from over, and the dangers only grow as James takes a step deeper into a world of corruption and deceit. Can he trust this mysterious ally, or will it lead to his downfall? Full Chapter 12. The warehouse was cold and dark, the air thick with the musty smell of old wood and stale concrete. James stood just inside the entrance, facing the mysterious man who had promised him the one thing he needed most: the evidence. To bring down Richard Graves. The man, tall and lean, his face hidden beneath a dark hood, remained still, his gaze fixed on James with an almost calculating intensity. He had called James here under the guise of offering him a chance to take down Graves, but there was something about the whole situation that didn't sit right. This didn't feel like a straightforward deal. It felt like a trap, one that James couldn't quite see the full shape of yet. "You've got the information," James said, his voice low, steady. "But I need to know what the catch is. What's the price for your help?" The man chuckled, a sound that echoed through the cold warehouse. "Straight to the point, huh? I respect that. You've got the courage, Carter, but I'm not doing this for free. And I'm not doing this out of charity. You want to take down Graves, you'll need to make some hard choices." James stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. He didn't like the sound of that. "What kind of choices?" The man's smirk faded, replaced by a hard look that made James uneasy. "Graves isn't the only one with power in this town. I've Got my own network, my own interests. You're trying to bring down one of the biggest players in the game, but you're not going to get far without understanding that there are other forces at play here, forces that you might not be able to handle. James didn't flinch. I'm not backing down. The man nodded as if James had just proved something to him. Good, I like that. But understand this, if you want to take down Graves, you'll need more than just the right information. You'll need support, you'll need leverage, and most importantly, you'll need to understand the game you're playing. I can give you all of that, but there's a price. James's jaw clenched. What's the price? The man stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with something dark and dangerous. You're not the only one who wants Graves gone. But I'm not looking to take him down the same way you are. I don't care about exposing him. I care about taking what he's built for myself. If you want my help, you'll need to help me. In return, help me take him out of the picture permanently. Help me take control of the land Graves has been buying up. The words hit James like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about exposing Graves anymore. This wasn't even about surviving the raid or protecting his farm. This was a dangerous game of power, and the stakes were higher than he could have imagined. You're asking me to work with you, James said slowly, trying to wrap his head around the offer. You want me to help you take control of everything. Graves has been building? The man nodded, his eyes cold. That's right. I can give you the tools to bring him down, but you'll need to help me take over. This land, this power, it all comes with a price. You help me, and I'll make sure you get what you want. But there's no turning back once you make this deal. James stood still for a long moment, the weight of the situation pressing on him. This wasn't the fight he had imagined. He had come here to protect his land, to defend everything he had worked for. But now, the price for taking down. Graves wasn't just about protecting his farm. It was about becoming part of the system, a system of power, corruption, and manipulation. He thought about the farm, about the people who had helped him, and about what they would lose if Graves succeeded. But the price for stopping Graves now seemed so high. What if it wasn't just about defeating him? What if James was being drawn into a deeper web of deceit, one he wouldn't be able to escape? Tell me more, James said, his voice low. What's your plan? The man smiled, a cold and knowing smile. It's simple. You get me close to Graves. You help me disrupt his operations. Get him out of the picture. I'll make sure you have the evidence to take him down. We'll take his empire for ourselves, and you'll get your farm back. You'll have power, Carter. You'll have everything you've been fighting for. James shook his head slowly, the decision weighing heavily on him. He had always been a man of principle. He had fought wars, but never for personal gain, never for power. But now, it seemed like his only option was to play the game, a game he had never wanted to be a part of. I'm not sure I like the sound of this, James said, his voice hard. The man stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You're not here to make friends, Carter. You're here to survive. And in this world, if you want to survive, you have to be willing to get your hands dirty. James looked the man in the eye. And if I refuse? The man's smile never wavered. Then you'll be just another casualty in a much bigger game. Graves will find a way to eliminate you. You'll be left with nothing. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and James felt the weight of them settle on his shoulders. He didn't trust this man, didn't like the deal that was being offered, but he also knew that he couldn't take down Graves on his own. The stakes were too high, the system was too entrenched, and in order to survive, he would need to make an impossible choice. For a long moment, James stood in silence, his mind racing through the options, through the risks, through the consequences of every move he could make. Finally, he spoke. All right, James said, his voice steady but laced, with a hint of steel. I'll help you, but this doesn't change who I am. You make sure Graves is taken down, and I'll help you take him down. But I won't become like you. I won't lose myself in this game. The man's smile widened. You'll learn, Carter. You'll learn that in this game, there are no rules. But you've made the right choice. Now let's finish what we started. The deal was struck, the game was on, and James knew that there was no going back. James has made the decision to work with the mysterious figure, but in doing so he has taken the first step into a world of power and corruption. The cost of victory is steep, and James now finds himself entangled in a web of deceit and manipulation that could cost him everything. As the stakes rise, James must decide if he can maintain his integrity while playing the game that is about to consume him. Full Chapter 13. James had never been a man to trust easily. His time in Delta Force had taught him that trust was a luxury you couldn't afford, especially when your survival depended on the loyalty of others. He had always relied on his instincts, the sharp sense of danger that had kept him alive through countless missions. But even now, as he stood in the middle of a deal that felt wrong from the start, his instincts told him something darker was unfolding. He looked out the window of the farmhouse, his eyes scanning the horizon. The farm, which had once been a peaceful retreat, now felt like the center of a storm. Richard Graves was still out there pulling the strings, manipulating the system. But the mysterious man who had offered James a chance to take Graves down was no longer an ally he could trust without question. Over the past few days, they had made progress. James had worked with the man, gathering more intel on Graves's operations and connections. Together, they had started to unravel the layers of corruption that Graves had built. It felt like they were getting closer, but the closer they got, the more uneasy James became. The man he was working with, the one who had promised to help him take Graves down, had his own agenda. James could feel it, the way he skirted around certain questions, the way he seemed to know more than he was letting on. The answers James had received weren't enough. The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit, and the more he learned, the more he suspected that he wasn't just fighting Graves, he was fighting against a much larger, much darker force. James sat in his office going through the files once more. He had been awake for hours, scanning over every piece of information they had on Graves, but something was missing. Something was off. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Daniel. "We've got a problem. Meet me in the barn." The urgency in Daniel's message was clear. James stood up without a second thought, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. He didn't waste time on questions. He had learned long ago that when something went wrong, you acted quickly, decisively. The barn was quiet, the shadows long and still as James stepped inside. Daniel was waiting for him, his face grim, his eyes scanning the room nervously. "James," Daniel said, his voice low, "I've been looking into the files you've been gathering. Something doesn't add up." James's stomach sank. "What do you mean?" "I've gone through everything, the connections, the names, and I found something that doesn't sit right," Daniel continued, his voice tightening with concern. "The man you're working with, he's not who he says he is." James's heart began to race. "What are you talking about?" Daniel looked around before stepping closer to James. "I dug into his past. I've got sources, James. This man has been involved in operations that they don't fit with what he's telling you. He's linked to people who have far more in power than Graves, and they don't have the same interest in exposing Graves that you do. This isn't just about taking Graves down. This is about taking everything." James felt a cold chill sweep over him. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but they didn't fit in the way he had hoped. The man he had trusted, the one who had promised him the chance to bring Graves to justice, was using him. He wasn't just trying to take Graves down, he had his own agenda, one that James didn't fully understand. "What do you want me to do?" James asked, his voice tight with the realization of what had been happening under his nose. Daniel paused, his eyes narrowing. "We need to be careful, James. If you continue working with this man, you might find yourself on the wrong side of this fight. We need to expose him, but we have to move fast. He's playing a dangerous game, and if we're not careful, we'll be pawns in it." James's mind raced as the gravity of the situation hit him. The man who had offered him a chance to fight back against Graves wasn't an ally. He was another player in a much larger game. And now James was stuck in the middle of it, a pawn he had been too blind to see. He had trusted this man. He had believed that together they could take down Graves, expose the corruption that had infiltrated every aspect of their lives. But now he wasn't so sure. The question that lingered in his mind was whether this was just another trap. Was he being manipulated into doing someone else's bidding? "Do you have proof?" James asked, his voice steady, though his mind was racing. Daniel nodded. "I'm not the only one who's noticed. There are others, people who've been watching. The man you're working with, he's not just after Graves, he's after power, and if you don't move quickly, he'll have it, and you won't even know what hit you." James's hands clenched into fists, the realization of his situation sinking in. He had thought he was in control. He had thought he was the one pulling the strings, but he was just as much a pawn as the men Graves had manipulated for years. And now the man he had trusted was using him, pulling him deeper into a game that James didn't want to play. "James," Daniel said, breaking through his thoughts, "this man is dangerous. We need to get ahead of him before it's too late." James looked up, his mind working through the possibilities. "How do we stop him?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "We expose him. We find his connections, his dealings. We take away the power he's built for himself, but we can't do it alone. We need to go to the people who can help, the ones Graves has underestimated. We've got to rally everyone who's been affected by this, James. We've got to stand up together." James felt a surge of anger. "I didn't come this far to be manipulated. I didn't come this far to let some shadowy figure take control." Daniel stepped forward, placing a hand on James's shoulder. "Then let's take control back." James didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. His mind was too active, too filled with the realization of how deep he was now in this web of corruption. He had made a deal with the devil, and now he had to figure out how to take down both Graves and the man who had promised him justice. He couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. The price of failure was too high. The next morning, James gathered his team. They had a new target now. It wasn't just about Graves. It was about the man who had manipulated them all along. They would expose the truth. And this time, James wasn't going to let anyone use him for their own gain. James has realized the truth. The man who promised him power and revenge isn't an ally, but a dangerous player in a much bigger game. The web of deceit is tighter than ever, and James must now fight not only against Richard Graves, but also against the forces behind him. The stakes are higher than ever, and the cost of victory is becoming more apparent with each passing day. Chapter 14. The morning after the revelation felt colder, as if the world had shifted just slightly out of balance. James stood in the farmhouse, staring out the window at the land he had worked so hard to protect, his thoughts churning. The battle against Richard Graves had always seemed like a personal mission, but now it felt as though he was fighting against a much darker force, one that had manipulated him from the start. The man he had trusted, the mysterious figure who had promised him victory, had turned out to be just another player in a corrupt system. And James was the one who had been used, but he wasn't going to let this be his end. He had come too far, fought too hard to back down now. His farm, his future, and everything he had worked for were on the line, and this time he would take control. James paced the floor, the reality of what he had to do setting in. He couldn't play by the rules anymore. The only way to take down Graves and the man behind him was to do whatever it took to expose them both. He had trusted the wrong people, but that didn't mean he had lost the battle. It just meant the fight had changed. The phone call came just as he was about to step outside. It was Daniel, his voice clipped and urgent. "James," Daniel said, "we've got a problem. Graves's men are moving in on the farm. This time, they're coming for everything. They're trying to wipe us out, and we don't have much time." James's stomach tightened. He had expected Graves to retaliate, but this was quicker than he had anticipated. The fight was coming to a head, and he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. "I'm not running," James said, his voice firm. "Get the team ready. We're not backing down. This ends now." The team assembled quickly, their faces set with grim determination. James could feel the resolve in the air. They weren't just here to protect the farm anymore. They were here to send a message. The stakes had escalated, and the battle was no longer about survival. It was about exposing the men who had been pulling the strings from the shadows, about making sure that their corruption was laid bare for everyone to see. As James and his team prepared for the final showdown, he knew that the odds were stacked against them. They were outnumbered, and Graves had more resources than they could ever hope to match. But James wasn't concerned with the odds anymore. He had nothing left to lose. If he was going to go down, he was going to take Graves and his ally with him. This time, there would be no second chances. He stood at the front of the team, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "We're not just defending the farm anymore. We're exposing the truth. We're taking down Graves, and we're making sure everyone knows what he's been doing, no matter what it takes." The hours passed in a blur of preparation. The team fortified the farm, setting up positions and making sure there were no weak points. Every member was in place, every angle covered. James was sharp, his mind racing through scenarios, calculating every move, and then the sound of engines broke the silence. The trucks were coming. James moved to the front line, his hand gripping the rifle tightly. He could see the headlights in the distance, the vehicles making their way down the long driveway, just as they had so many times before. But this time, things were different. This time, they weren't just going to let Graves take what he wanted. This time, James was going to make sure the truth came to light. The trucks stopped at the edge of the property, and James's team took up their positions, ready to strike. The air was thick with anticipation, the tension nearly unbearable. Then, the first figure stepped out of the truck, a man James recognized immediately, one of Graves's top enforcers. He was large, built like a tank, and he scanned the area, with a smirk on his face, clearly confident that they would win this fight. He had no idea what was waiting for him. James stepped forward, his rifle raised, his voice cutting through the silence. "This is where it ends. You're not getting anything from here." The man's smirk faded slightly, but he quickly recovered. "You think you can stop us? Graves is untouchable." James didn't flinch. "Not anymore." With a signal from James, the team opened fire, the sharp sound of gunshots echoing across the farm. The men scattered, returning fire, but they were outmatched. James and his team knew the land better than anyone, and they used it to their advantage. The fight was fierce, but it was clear that the raiders were losing ground. The battle raged on, but in the chaos, James spotted the figure he had been waiting for. The man who had promised him power, who had promised him victory. He was standing at the edge of the property, watching the fight unfold, his hands hidden in the pockets of his coat. It was clear now that this man wasn't just another criminal. He had been using James from the start, manipulating him into doing his bidding. James's blood boiled as he saw the man's smug expression. He couldn't let this continue. He couldn't let himself be used any longer. With a quick motion, James moved toward the man, weaving through the chaos of the battle. The gunfire echoed in his ears, but he didn't stop. He had one goal now: to take down the man who had betrayed him. The confrontation was quick. The man barely had time to react. Before James had him pinned against the fence, his rifle aimed directly at his chest. "You think you can take down Graves?" The man sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're nothing, just a tool." James's grip tightened on the rifle, his anger rising. "You used me. You lied to me." "I didn't lie," the man said, his voice cold. "I just told you what you wanted to hear. You're not the first person I've manipulated, and you won't be the last." James's finger hovered over the trigger, but something stopped him. He wasn't here to kill this man, not yet. He needed answers. He needed to expose the truth. "Tell me everything," James demanded. "How are you connected to Graves? What's the real plan?" The man chuckled, a sickly grin spreading across his face. "You're too late. Graves already has everything he needs. And you've made yourself a target. You've sealed your fate." Before James could respond, a shot rang out from the distance. The man crumpled to the ground, dead before he hit the dirt. James spun around, his eyes scanning the chaos. The battle was over. The enemy was defeated, but the final price had been paid. The man who had betrayed him was gone. And now James had one last thing to do: expose Richard Graves for the criminal he truly was. James has taken down one enemy, but Graves is still out there, more dangerous than ever. With his ally gone, James is now more determined than ever to take down the man who has built an empire of corruption. The fight isn't over. It's only just begun. And James is ready to take on whatever comes next, no matter the cost. Full chapter 15. The moon hung low over the horizon, casting an eerie light over the remains of the battlefield. James stood, his rifle resting against his chest, eyes scanning the once familiar land that had now become the stage for a brutal war. The farm, which had always been a place of solace, had been shattered by gunfire, lies, and betrayal. The men he had fought so hard to protect it from were gone, but the final confrontation loomed ahead. Richard Graves, the man who had orchestrated the entire thing, who had played a game of power, control, and destruction from behind the scenes. James had come face to face with the truth now, and the only way out was through. The final battle was on the horizon. James walked across the wreckage of the farm, the memories of everything he had fought for flashing in his mind. The barn, the farmhouse, the open fields, they all seemed different now, as if the land itself carried the weight of all the pain and bloodshed. But amidst the destruction, James saw something else: determination. It was the same determination that had driven him through every mission, every battle, every moment when the odds were stacked against him. He wasn't going to lose this fight. Not now, not after everything. His team was assembled around him, silent but resolute. Daniel stood by his side, his eyes dark with the same unspoken understanding. They had come this far, and they weren't turning back. Together, they had fought off raiders, exposed lies, and destroyed one enemy. But now, they were going after the heart of the corruption itself. "We've got one shot at this," James said, his voice steady but heavy. "Graves doesn't just want the farm. He wants control over everything, over everyone. We're not just fighting for the farm anymore. We're fighting for the truth, for the people who've been manipulated and oppressed by men like him." Daniel nodded, the weight of the mission clear in his eyes. "We're with you, James. Let's finish this." The air around them was thick with anticipation, but James didn't let his nerves show. There was no room for hesitation now. The pieces had fallen into place, and it was time to make the final move. They couldn't allow Graves to win, not when the truth was so close. By the time night had fully settled in, the team was in position. The sound of engines rumbled in the distance. Graves's men were on the move, just as James had anticipated. He didn't flinch. He had been through countless standoffs in the past, but this felt different. This was personal. "This is it," James whispered into his comms. his fingers tightening around the trigger of his rifle. "We hold the line." The team took their positions, using the darkness as cover, ready to spring into action. The raiders had been defeated once, but Graves's men were another level of threat entirely. They were organized, well-equipped, and ruthless. James knew they wouldn't back down, but he also knew they had underestimated him. As the first of the vehicles came into view, James's grip tightened. He could see them now. Armed men disembarking from trucks, their steps quick and purposeful. They weren't just here to fight, they were here to take everything, and they knew what they had to do to make sure no one stood in their way. James's eyes narrowed, scanning the area. Graves was somewhere behind all of this, a shadow in the background, pulling strings, watching. He hadn't shown his face yet, but James knew the time was coming. He was waiting for the right moment to strike, and James wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of playing the waiting game. "Now," James muttered, his voice low and controlled. The team opened fire in perfect unison. The first wave of raiders stumbled, disoriented by the rapid attack, but they quickly recovered, returning fire with precision. Gunshots filled the air, but James wasn't just focused on the battle. His mind was on Graves. He needed to know where the man was hiding. He needed to face him, confront him, expose him for everything he had done. Daniel's voice came through the comms. "We've got them pushed back. They're regrouping near the east side of the field." James's heart raced. The eastern edge of the farm was where Graves's men had first tried to break through, and it was the last weak point in their defenses. It was there that James knew the final showdown would take place. As he moved forward, James's senses heightened, every nerve on edge. His team was holding the line, but it wouldn't be enough unless they took out Graves and his top enforcers. James needed to be where the action was. He needed to find Graves and bring this fight to an end. He moved through the tall grass, keeping low, using the cover to his advantage. He could hear the sounds of the battle raging on in the distance, but it all felt like background noise now. His focus was singular. Graves. He was out there, and James was going to make sure he didn't escape. It didn't take long before James saw him, the figure in the distance, standing alone in the shadows. Richard Graves. The man who had orchestrated all of this, the one responsible for the pain and the suffering that had plagued this land. He was finally in front of James, and this time there was no escape for him. Graves didn't flinch when he saw James approach, his expression cold and indifferent. He stood there, his hands in his pockets as though he had all the time in the world. "You've made it this far, Carter," Graves said, his voice a calm, mocking drawl. "But you're too late. You think you can take me down. You're nothing but a pawn in this game." James's heart pounded, but his voice was steady. "I'm not your pawn, Graves. This ends now." Graves chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. "You think I'm the one who's been playing games? You've been a part of this just as much as I have, Carter. You made the choice to join the game, and now you're going to lose." But James wasn't listening anymore. He had heard enough. He raised his rifle, aiming it directly at Graves's chest. This was the moment where everything changed. Graves's smirk faded as he realized what was happening. He had underestimated James, just like everyone else who had tried to take him down, and now the tables had turned. James took a deep breath, his finger poised over the trigger. James stands face to face with Richard Graves, the man responsible for all the chaos and suffering. But the fight is far from over. What price will James have to pay to bring Graves down? Will he emerge victorious, or will the system of power and corruption continue to reign supreme? The final showdown is here, but the cost of victory may be higher than James ever imagined.